Saṁyutta Nikāya, the Connected Discourses, Sagāthāvagga Saṁyutta, Vana Saṁyutta, Connected Discourses with the Forest Grove, Vana Vagga, Suttas 9.1 to 9.14. Sutta number 9.1, Viveka Sutta, on renouncing. This is what I personally heard. Once there was a certain bhikkhu who had gone into seclusion and chosen to spend his time training while living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan country. One day, during his day's meditation practice, that bhikkhu became immersed in an unwholesome state of mind, where he began entertaining evil and harmful thoughts pertaining to his previous life as a householder. Now at that time there was a deva living in that same forest, who, on witnessing what was taking place, out of compassion for that bhikkhu, decided to intervene by stirring up his sense of urgency. Thus, by approaching him, the deva began speaking these words to him in verse. You've entered the forest grove, seeking seclusion, but your mind still jumps out to and grabs onto unfitting things, entertaining yourself with things that have to do with the world outside, despite being a person yourself. You have to get rid of that deep longing to see and be with other people, for only then will you settle and be truly happy here. For this reason, you must quickly drop this obsession with the things of the world and stop looking at your choice to be here with such aversion. I'm here to remind you of this, so pay heed, because the deep abyss of defilements you have to cross is already quite enormous, without you hauling around these sensual thoughts. So, pull yourself out of the sticky marshland of lustful thoughts immediately. In just the same way that a bird fallen into the mud quickly shakes off whatever's been caught in its feathers, by freeing itself from being bogged down with the added incapacitating weight, so it can speedily take flight again. Similarly, you must shake off these states that only bind and burden you by becoming a bhikkhu who's resolute and driven with strong energy anew. Then, on hearing these words spoken to him by that deva, the bhikkhu was quickly jolted with a strong sense of urgency, which led him to re-engage in his practice by resolutely dedicating himself to the training. Sutta number 9.2, Upaṭṭhāna Sutta, Get Up. Once there was a bhikkhu who had decided to go and live in seclusion within a certain forested area in the Kosalan region. However, instead of engaging himself in the training, meditating, he was regularly spending his time sleeping throughout the day and lounging about. Witnessing what was going on, a deva, who also lived in that forest, out of compassion, decided to intervene by stirring the bhikkhu's sense of urgency. So, in order to help that bhikkhu, the deva approached the venerable, intent on reminding him as to why he had decided to go forth and to seek out seclusion in the first place. Drawing closer to him, the Deva spoke these verses. Get up, Bhikkhu. What are you doing lying about, sleeping your hours away? How in the world will you get rid of your affliction when the arrow you're struck with you continue to ignore while you procrastinate and delay? Once having gone forth and renounced the faith that led you to such a decision to walk out of your home's safety, to come here and dwell all alone, must never be allowed to weaken or wane, O Bhikkhu, while you keep sleeping like this. So you must intensify that fire within, that same faith that brought you here in the first place. Sensual comforts and pleasures are by nature unsteady, temporary, unreliable, and without an essence. Yet, careless fools and idiots keep falling for them, living simply to lounge about, to eat, urinate, and defecate too. Is that really why you decided to push yourself into doing what's not easy to do by going forth and becoming a bhikkhu? Really? To demolish through and obliterate passion and lust by adhering to the training prescribed, ignorance gets to be finally overcome and utterly destroyed. That's how true knowledge is to be won, by you giving it your all and nothing less. Otherwise, why even decide to go forth or become a bhikkhu, really? To cut off and sever ignorance completely, with wise understanding that is so hard to gain, one can truly put an end to the asavas leaking into the heart, and thus become truly sorrowless and trouble-free. Otherwise, why even bother to go forth or become a bhikkhu, really? So unless you muster up the energy within your heart, become resolute and maintain a vigorous attitude in your pursuit, as you steadily work your way towards Nibbana Supreme, otherwise there's really no point in wasting time here, imagining yourself to be doing something that is not easy to do, when all you're doing is simply pretending to be a bhikkhu. Sutta number 9.3, Kassapagotta Sutta, with Kassapagotta. Once, the Venerable Kassapagotta was living in a certain forested area in the Kosalan region. However, instead of engaging in his meditation or seek out seclusion, the Venerable Kassapagotta was spending his time advising villagers who were wandering through the forest. Now, at that time, there was a Deva who also lived in that same forest, who, on witnessing what was taking place, out of compassion decided to intervene by stirring the bhikkhu's sense of urgency. So, to help the Venerable, the Deva approached the Venerable Kassapagotta and spoke these verses. These people who drift through the forest, with their interest in the Dhamma being next to nil, simply go on wandering in these remote areas, while having neither the intelligence nor the depth to be discussing Dhamma with them. So why waste your time, bhikkhu, as the hours slip by with you chatting? This indeed seems quite a foolish thing to be doing. Although you speak much, but this empty barrel of a man who wanders through the rugged mountains does not even get a hint, nor grasp what's being shared with him. For even in broad daylight he cannot see what's in front of him, let alone what you're wastefully trying to teach him. After all, even if you were to light up 10 massive upright standing oil lamps and put him in the middle, oh Kassapa, he will still be too blind to see a thing. That's because his eyes are truly covered with dust. Hence, it's futile to think that he could somehow see. Then, on hearing these words spoken to him by that Deva, the Venerable Kassapagotta was quickly jolted into a sudden sense of urgency, which led him immediately back to seclude himself in the forest, away from everyone, to resolutely pursue his training. Sutta number 9.4, Sambahula Sutta, a group of bhikkhus. Once, a group of several bhikkhus had gone and secluded themselves in a remote area within a certain forested area in the Kosalan country. Later, once they had completed the 3 months of the monsoon season, while remaining and living in that place, they decided to leave and go wandering. Then, on seeing they had all left, a Deva who also lived in the area became sad and started weeping, while uttering these words in lament. So many spots are now left empty, where they once used to be. Those lovely beings, who both knew and spoke brilliantly from the heart, the precious disciples of Gautama, they must have truly hated spending their time here. Where have they gone off to and left us like this? Then another Deva replied by speaking similarly in verse, and said, Some of them are on their way to Magadha, others are now in other parts of Kosala, while still others are on their way to the land of the Vajji princes. Those beings are like the deer, freely moving about, roaming from one place to the next, with no place for them to call a home. Those are bhikkhus who truly cannot be tied down. Sutta number 9.5, Ānanda Sutta, the Venerable Ānanda. Once, the Venerable Ānanda was living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan country. However, despite having gone into seclusion, the Venerable Ānanda was still engaged in talking with and teaching lay people, spending most of his time interacting with them rather than dedicating his time to his training. Now, at that time, there was a Deva who also lived in that same forest, who, on witnessing what was taking place, out of compassion for the Venerable Ānanda, decided to intervene by stirring up his sense of urgency. Thus, the Deva approached the Venerable Ānanda and spoke these words to him. Now that you've left all other things behind and gone to seclusion in the forest, sitting at the foot of a tree, while deep into your heart you've placed Nibbana Supreme as the only goal. Meditate then, O Gautama. Meditate and stop being negligent by wasting your time already. Anyhow, what does all this hurly-burly world have anything to do with you and what you're here to do? Then, on hearing these words spoken to him by that Deva, the Venerable Ānanda was quickly jolted into a sudden sense of urgency, which led him immediately back to seclude himself in the forest, away from everyone, to resolutely pursue his training. Sutta number 9.6. Anuruddha Sutta. The Venerable Anuruddha. Once, the Venerable Anuruddha was dwelling in a certain forested area within the Kosalan region, where a Talvatimsa Deva from the heavenly realm of the 33 approached him. Now this Deva, whose name was Jalini, knew the Venerable Anuruddha from one of his past lives, where she had been his wife. Then, having approached, that Deva began addressing the Venerable Anuruddha while speaking in verse. Turn your heart back to us and the place where you used to be, the realm where we lived happily together among the joyful gods of the 33. Back where all of your heart's desires were fulfilled, while being surrounded by the most beautiful of women in the entire cosmos. Goddesses surrounding you on all sides, cherishing you deeply, as they were delighted in serving and pleasing you in every way, where you used to be the most radiantly handsome Deva to be around. Then the Venerable Anuruddha addressed that Deva by responding to her, as he too spoke in verse. The goddesses of the divine realms, whom you call the most beautiful of women in the entire cosmos, are in fact stuck in their self-absorbed world of constant I-making, and thus, much like those who long to end up with them, to be surrounded by their heavenly company of delights, are and will be experiencing true misery, for both are truly in a most sorry state. That Deva then continued addressing the Venerable Anuruddha in verse. Ah, one hasn't really tasted nor known the meaning of delight until one gets the chance to be in the grove of Nandana. That's really the place to get lost in pleasure, which is the favorite spot to be for all the gods of the 33. The Venerable Anuruddha again replied to that Deva by saying, You're a divine idiot. For haven't you learnt anything from the words you've heard the Arahants speak? Don't you realize that all things that are conditioned are already impermanent, hence are doomed to loss and decay? After all, that's in their very nature, to have a beginning, but to come to an inevitable end, leaving you utterly empty and in suffering. Whatever arises is going to cease sooner or later. So instead of this foolishness of yours, know that the bliss you're really after is to be found, however, when you realize that the incessant drive to go seeking after for more delights in you is finally subdued and fully calmed. So know this, O Jalini, there are no divine realms left for me to be reborn into ever again, whether it's Tavatimsa or the many others that are far superior to it. My sojourning through the endless cycles of samsara is now totally destroyed, and with it all future lives. Sutta number 9.7. Nāgadatta Sutta. The Venerable Nāgadatta. Once, the Venerable Nāgadatta was living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan region, where he had resorted to live secluded while dedicating himself to the training. This took place at the time when the Venerable Nāgadatta would wake up early and head straight to the town nearby, only returning back late in the day, after having spent most of his time away from the seclusion of the forest. Now, witnessing what was really going on, a deva, who also lived in that forest, decided to intervene. So, in order to help the venerable Nāgadatta, the deva, feeling compassion towards him, approached the venerable, intent on reminding him as to why he had decided to go forth and to seek out seclusion in the first place. Drawing closer to him, the deva spoke these verses to the venerable Nāgadatta. Heading out of the forest at the crack of dawn, eager to join the townfolk in the village, only to return late when the day is already done, Nāgadatta loves spending his time with householders, it seems, enjoying himself by mingling and mixing with them in both their troubles and cheers. So sad is his predicament indeed, for I do fear for Nāgadatta in his reckless trajectory, wasting his time with the attachments he's building with families. I so hope he still has time not to fall prey to the death's sudden blow, and thus lose this rare opportunity he has, instead of being crushed under the certain might of death. Now, on hearing these words spoken to him by that deva, the venerable Nāgadatta was quickly jolted into a sudden sense of urgency, which led him immediately back to the training for which he had gone into seclusion in the forest. Sutta number 9.8. Kulagharaṇī Sutta, the Lady of the House. Once there was a bhikkhu who had gone into a certain forested area within the Kosalan country to dwell in seclusion to practice. However, despite intending to go into seclusion, that bhikkhu somehow managed to get involved in the householders' affairs of a particular family, given his numerous interactions with them. Now, witnessing this taking place was a deva, who also lived in that same forest, who, out of compassion for that bhikkhu, decided to intervene by stirring in him a strong sense of urgency. Then, by taking the shape of the lady of the house, the bhikkhu was frequenting, the deva, now manifesting as the wife of the householder, began speaking to that bhikkhu these words in verse. Roaming about here and there, whether by loitering around by the river bank that's a favorite hangout for you, or at byways on the main road and everywhere else, where you hope to meet and interact with people and householders, dragging yourself in all the gossipy ongoings between them. No wonder you're now enmeshed in their affairs, sullied in all that foolish hubbub. There will be many kinds of disturbing sounds to invade your space, or come to test and try to shake you from your peace. But the real recluse is the one who endures all of that and much more. So nothing should jolt or even annoy you when your practice has your full dedication behind it as its support. All that you hear, after all, is simply there as part of your training, with nothing there in the forest meant to afflict you, really. So the next time you hear a sudden crackling sound, such as a deer quietly foraging on the forest floor, no need for you to lose your composure or panic either. Hold yourself strong and don't go running back to your kind. Otherwise, you'll be recognized as being skittish and not much else, fickle at heart and not at all serious about the task, far from ever succeeding in the attainment of what your heart truly seeks. Sutta number 9.9. Vajjipitta Sutta, son of the Vajjis. Once there was a bhikkhu from the Vajji region who had gone into a certain wooded area in Vesali. Then, one day, it occurred that the Vajji princes and their populace were celebrating an event that went on all day and all night, playing all kinds of instruments and making a great deal of ruckus. At this, the bhikkhu, who had entered Vesali's forests to seclude himself and dedicated his effort to the training, suddenly found himself becoming agitated on hearing that sound of beating of drums, the singing and the musical instruments being played by the Vajjis celebrating nearby. Then that bhikkhu became melancholic as he reminisced the experiences he would be missing while living alone away from the crowds within that forest, while the community kept on celebrating joyfully in that event without him taking part in it. Thus, in his resentful discontent of his predicament, he began saying the following to himself: "We've come here seeking seclusion, having thrown ourselves into isolation here in the forest, where I'm supposed to live alone and be cut off from the familiar. But now the world comes calling me with its joyful cries of celebration, and with merriment that's so familiar to me, yet I keep myself away from it all, as though I were exiled indeed. Truly, tonight no one can be in a worse state than me." Meanwhile, a certain deva living in that same forest, who on witnessing what was taking place, out of compassion for that bhikkhu, decided to intervene by stirring up his sense of urgency. So the deva approached the bhikkhu and began speaking in verse by saying, "You don't realize how significant it is for you to come here seeking seclusion, having thrown yourself into isolation in this part of the forest, to live alone and be cut off from the familiar. You don't see how the world holds what you're doing in such high regard, where people know they cannot do what you've come here to do, seeking seclusion by breaking away from the world and all that's familiar to you. So it's the other way around, you see, where those whom you now seem to envy, in fact, look upon you with such envy, in the same manner as those beings who, on being born into hell, look on with resentment at all those fortunate ones who are about to be born into heavenly realms." Then, on hearing these words spoken to him by that deva, the bhikkhu was quickly jolted with a strong sense of urgency, which led him to re-engage in his practice by resolutely dedicating himself to the training. Sutta number 9.10. Sajjhāya Sutta, engaged in reciting. Once there was a bhikkhu who was living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan country. However, even though he had gone into seclusion, that bhikkhu kept spending most of his time chanting and reciting the teachings. But then, one day, he became quiet and focused on his efforts by dedicating his time and energy to doing the actual practice. Now, at that time there was a deva living in that same forest, who on witnessing this decided to approach that bhikkhu and spoke these words to him. Bhikkhu, why don't you recite the teachings any more? After all, living with and around bhikkhus, one has a chance to hear the words of the teacher being recited. This then helps the Dhamma to sprout and grow in one's heart, while the one doing the reciting also benefits, as he'll be praised while still here in this very body. The bhikkhu then replied to that deva by saying, In the past, I valued so much the act of reciting. As I kept chanting the verses of Dhamma I memorized, that is, so long as I had not yet realized the truth in their meaning, for I had still not attained to the state of fading away of passions. But once I did realize the fading away of passion towards all things, then the other was dropped, and all that was left were the seen, the heard, and the sensed, being experienced in this very body. Sutta number 9.11. Akusala Vitakka Sutta. Damaging thoughts. Once there was a certain bhikkhu who had gone into the remote forests in the Kosalan countryside, seeking seclusion, while dedicating his time to serious practice. Then, one day, it so happened that while in meditation, he began entertaining a series of damaging thoughts, sensual, evil, and unskillful thoughts that were pernicious and quite harmful to his heart. Meanwhile, a deva living close by in the forest saw what was taking place, and how the bhikkhu had gone off course in his meditation. So, out of compassion for this bhikkhu, the deva decided to help by reigniting the sense of urgency in him. Thus, by approaching the bhikkhu, the deva then began uttering these words in verse. By giving your unwise attention to such things, you're becoming inflamed and utterly lost in passionate thoughts. Relinquish them quickly by dropping this unwise reflection of yours, and bring your focus back to the work at hand with your fully present, wise, reflective attention. To do this, bring the teacher to mind. Recollect the Dhamma and the noble Sangha too, as well as your own virtue, O Bhikkhu. And very quickly you'll be comforted by the sense of ease, with spiritual joy and delight pervading throughout your entire being, where you'll remain so utterly contented in the comfort of soothing happiness that overflows your very heart. This way, soon you will put an end to suffering and be completely done with this work. Then, on hearing these words, spoken to him by the deva, that bhikkhu quickly realized his mistake and became jolted with a strong sense of urgency, which led him to re-engage in his practice by resolutely dedicating himself to the training. Sutta number 9.12. Majjhanika Sutta. Midday. Once there was a bhikkhu who was living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan country. Now at that time there was a Deva living in that same forest, who one day decided to approach the Bhikkhu. Then, having come close, the Deva began expressing these words to him. At midday, when the sun is high, and all the birds and animals have retired, and are now taking their day's rest, this mighty forest, in its absolute stillness, suddenly becomes eerily quiet and unsettling, and this itself is quite startling to me, for it truly brings up fear in me. The Bhikkhu then replied to that Deva by saying, At midday, when the sun is high, and all the birds and animals have retired, and are now taking their day's rest, this mighty forest, in its absolute stillness, suddenly becomes so calm and serene indeed. And this itself is quite lovely to me, for it truly brings up delight in me. Sutta number 9.13. Pākatindriya Sutta. With faculties unrestrained. Once there was a group of bhikkhus living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan region. Now these monks were unrestrained in their faculties, as well as quite lazy and inconsistent in their endeavor, being crude in their manners and vulgar, possessing low character, while lacking both mindfulness and full awareness of themselves in their conduct, and deeply held conceit in their hearts. They were truly restless and quite resentful and ambivalent as to why they were even there in the forest in the first place. As a result, they were unable to enter into samadhi, for they were given to baser tendencies unbefitting of practicing bhikkhus. Witnessing all that was going on, a Deva, who also lived in that forest, decided to approach them, to say a few words, to try and shake them up into a sense of urgency. Thus, drawing closer to them, the Deva spoke these verses to those bhikkhus. The disciples of Gautama used to live contentedly in the safety of their happiness, satisfied with the alms food they would obtain, and the small huts they called a dwelling. They went on practicing without any longing for better accommodations, thus realizing how all things in existence are passing and impermanent. They used to strive on ever so resolutely to put an end to all suffering. However, that appears to not be the case here any more, for they have turned themselves into village chieftains or rulers of kingdoms, seeking a life of luxury as their main occupation is getting food and then lying down to rest, always craving for and coveting the things that others possess, but they do not. Now, I raise my joint palms in Anjali, paying my heartfelt homage to you, O Sangha. Yet the unblemished respect in my heart is to you, O pure Sangha, and not to such monks I witness here. For these low lives I speak in reference to here are mere clowns and pretenders, who are already abandoned and left without anyone to protect them, no different than those who are lost, having already died. I do not speak of the true Sangha here, but only those who go on living in heedlessness, the ones who are already lost due to their negligence from doing all that must be done by a genuine recluse. Therefore, I always pay homage to those true disciples of Gautama who continuously live in heedfulness, the ones who wholeheartedly are practicing the path and doing so with complete diligence. Sutta number 9.14. Gandhatthena Sutta. The fragrance thief. Once there was a bhikkhu who was living in a certain forested area within the Kosalan region, where he had resorted to dwell secluded, dedicating himself to the training. Then, one day, on his return from his alms round, having already eaten his meal, he decided to take a dip into the nearby lotus pond. While still in the water, he began smelling and delighting in the fragrance of the lotus flowers surrounding him in the pond. Now witnessing all this taking place was a deva, who also lived in that forest, who, recognizing the mental state of that bhikkhu, while feeling compassion towards him, decided to intervene. This in order to help him regain his sense of urgency, reminding him as to why he had decided to go forth and to seek out seclusion in the first place. So the deva approached and began speaking these verses to that bhikkhu. Thief! No one had given or offered you that lotus to begin with, nor even its fragrance for you to just come here and steal it away by smelling it. Because if this one act of yours, of taking what's not given to you, you, venerable sir, are indeed a fragrance thief. Then that bhikkhu responded while being startled by this accusation, as he said in reply, "Why would you call me a thief? I have simply smelled the lotus flower, and that's all. This I did from afar, and without even touching it, nor plucking it from its stalk within the pond. So how could you or anyone find this act of mine to be somehow equal to the taking of what's not given? Why are you then calling me a fragrance thief, and so unfairly too? Instead of wrongly accusing me, you should go and accuse others of such acts, who carelessly tear off, pluck, and cut these lovely lotuses from their stalks, stealing them away and pulling them from their very roots, while destroying so many of them in the process. So you should go after such characters and not me, blaming them for their savagery in stealing. All those who grab hold of and rip apart these beautiful lotus flowers, instead of standing here and accusing me for stealing their fragrance from afar." In reply, the deva then responded to the bhikkhu by continuing to speak in verse. Well, nothing could be said really to such people whom you mention, those who are hopelessly set in their ways, ruffians and vulgar of character, who are no more than a dirty wiping-cloth, really, at the hands of a maid doing her house-cleaning. However, speaking to you on this matter, by pointing out the possible danger in such an act, to someone so dedicated to purifying his heart is truly worth the effort for me to come and point it out to you. You, who are indeed without a blemish to speak of, where even the tiniest tip of a hair-sized wrongdoing is indeed too much for you to tolerate, as it feels much bigger than a massive cloud covering the blue skies above. Now feeling comforted, the bhikkhu then replied to the deva, while speaking in verse. Ah, now I see, O Yakka, the purpose in your accusation of me. For in fact, you truly understand me, it seems. In that case, I ask that you please stop me and alert me the next time you witness a similar behavior from me, speaking to me like this whenever I go astray. But the deva replied to the bhikkhu by saying the following words instead. It's neither my task nor duty to stop and alert you at every turn, for I'm not your teacher nor servant even, to be guiding you by warning you along the way. Bhikkhu, it's your own task and very duty to stay alert, and thus to recognize what's right conduct from all that's wrong. Thus, it's up to you to maintain your course on this path, so that you may continue walking on it and therefore reach true happiness and peace yourself. Being thus deeply moved by that wise deva's words, the bhikkhu was jolted in his heart, becoming suddenly reignited by a strong sense of urgency to practice with more diligence to attain the highest goal. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.